Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and by other public television stations.
Norman Mailer's new book is judged by most of the critics a masterpiece. Whether it is that only the unseducible judgment of history that moves as slowly as a federal agency will say, whatever the final judgment, it is a remarkable book not only for what it accomplishes, the transcription of the life and death of Gary Gilmore, murderer, but for the way in which it is done. Suddenly, one of the most rococo writers of the 20th century sounds almost like Dashiell Hammett or Ernest Hemingway. As critic James Walcott observed on picking up The Executioner's Song, quotes, "I assumed that Mailer would use the occasion to unveil his own psychology of the hangman, turning Gilmore's life into a crime and punishment saga seething with blood, madness, nihilism, damnation, blank cartridges, and beggarly redemption. Once again, Norman Mailer would roll out the Dostoevskian cannons and leave the landscape covered with smoke. Nothing of the sort, as you will discover, has happened. This is not a book about Mailer, and not a book which, were you to pick it up not knowing the identity of the author, would lead you to guess his identity. You would, however, know instantly that you were in the hands of a master." Norman Mailer is the most prominent living American novelist. In addition, he is the most notorious American novelist, devoting his time equally to literary production and self-abuse. He is tangled with the Pentagon, the feminists, the critical establishment, booze, prize fighters, presidents, and me. He went to Harvard and fought in Asia as an infantryman and gave birth to The Naked and the Dead, becoming a lion at age 25. He was co-founder of the Village Voice. He ran for mayor of New York. He won the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. And he has been at work for 30 years on the great American novel. And there are those who believe that in The Executioner's Song, he has in fact written it. The examiner will be Jeff Greenfield, about whom more in due course. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Mailer whether he intended that his book should be adopted by fundamentalists on the subject of capital punishment.
I had no, well, how to put it. I found in writing this book that I've put away just about every attitude and stance that I developed over those 30 years of writing. And part of the pleasure and part of the difficulty of the book was that it was a matter of surveying unfamiliar ground. So I've discovered that I had very few attitudes by the time I finished. I started the book with a great many ideas. When I began the book, I thought I'd probably do an essay on the nature of capital punishment, on what to do with our prisons, on why people murder, on karma, on a dozen different things. I was drawn to the book because Gary Gilmore embodied all these questions. And I discovered as I wrote it and as the material came in and as I went out and got more material, because the book is based upon hundreds of interviews, that I knew less and less. Or put it this way, I knew more and more and I understood less and less. And I finally found myself in the position of a man who, let's say, has been married to a woman for 10, 20, or 30 years and knows her inside out, knows every last single thing that she'll do, but doesn't understand her at all. That is, doesn't understand her in the sense he doesn't know if her moral nature is superior to his or his is to her. By the same token, by the time I finished the book, I didn't have a clear feeling about capital punishment. I could give you less of a firm idea of what I think about it now than when I started.
I think you struggled very successfully throughout the book to not to weight it. However, during the execution scene, it seems to me that the writer of those words is empathically there with the friends of Gilmore rather than with the executioners of Gilmore. And there is a sense there in which there is a poetic disturbance. Now, when you discuss the victims of Gilmore, you take some care to give their background so that the reader feels a sense of identification with them, but not quite in the way in which he feels an identification with Gilmore towards the end, which is why I paused to ask you that question.
Mm-hmm.
Now you tell me that you left the book without any commitments on the question of capital punishment.
Yes, but to answer your objection, which I think is a legitimate one, there's next to nothing about the executioners in the last part of the book. The execution.
Well, not the actual three guys, but I mean the prosecutor.
5 guys,
and,
Will.
There were 3 shots, but there were supposed to be 4 shots. There were 4 bullets.
One bullet's a blank, and there are 4 real bullets.
That's right, yeah.
And 3 shots were heard because apparently 2 guns went off at once.
Yeah. No, I'm not suggesting that. I meant executioners broadly speaking, the warden, the prosecutor, and the various people of the 50 people there who were more or less in sympathy with the operation.
The reason is simple. I built the book on interviews, and I was determined to be scrupulous to the interviews and to be fair to everyone, because I think in a funny way that this is stretching the meaning of a word, but I think when you interview someone, there's a faint suggestion of the sacramental about it, particularly if you break bread, if you're eating with someone while you're interviewing them. In fact, I don't even like interviewing people, because I feel once I've interviewed someone, it's much harder to write critically about them unless you bring up every critical feeling you have in the course of the interview.
Yeah, I noticed that about Jimmy Carter last time I saw you.
Yes, it's very hard to, well, it's that left jab of yours that'll be the, that's bound to, I expect tonight I expect to feel a small headache in the back of my head. But leaving Jimmy Carter out of it for the moment, if you don't mind. I mean, what if I did that to you and brought up a subject from the moon, like Jimmy Carter? But going back to this, I wanted very much to interview the executioners. There were practical reasons why you couldn't reach them. And one of them is that it was terribly important to the state of Utah to keep their identity secret. And for a good cause from their point of view, since anybody who's been an executioner gets put on a convict's hit list. Now, that doesn't mean that convicts are literally going to get together and once they get out of prison, they're going to make it their business to find that guy out and shoot him. But after all, nobody wants to live with that tension that it's one more care that you carry around with you. And so the state was very careful to keep the names of the executioners secret. That was one part of it. And then the warden, Sam Smith, refused to be interviewed. He'd had some bad experiences with Truman Capote, and then he'd had some bad experiences with Larry Schiller. And by the time I came along, he didn't want to talk to me at all. And that was a great loss. I think the book would have been better if I could have gotten into the warden's mind. But I wasn't going to make up what was in anyone's mind in this book. I felt I discovered a method that was most interesting, which was to be absolutely scrupulous about what people told me to the best of my ability. You know, you discover that when you try to be pure, you're doing remarkably well if you can be 99 and 44, 100% pure. I discovered that invention is a natural faculty of man, like wiping one's mouth after you eat.
Truth is asymptotic.
Asymptotic. Mm-hmm. What does that mean?
It's that curve that never quite, it gets closer and closer but never quite reaches.
Yes,
like poverty.
Yeah. Yes.
Take a second before we go on, if you will, to tell the audience whose memory is short, even though the events of January 1977 were awfully vivid at the time, what it is that Gilmore was executed for, because it will help, I think, to understand the discussion more fully as we move. Would you mind doing that?
All right. Gilmore was Gilmore murdered 2 people in July 19th and 20th of 1976, and he was captured on the second night and was brought to trial in October and found guilty and sentenced to death. And then in November, I think it was the 1st of November or the 3rd of November, he said that he did not wish to appeal his sentence, and he wanted his execution to take place as it was scheduled. At that time, the execution was scheduled for November 15th. And what happened is that some people began to appeal. People began to appeal from all over. Various social groups appealed the execution. Gilmore's mother appealed it. And before it was all over, there were many delays, there were many stays of execution, and Gilmore was finally not executed until January 17th, which is something like half a year after he committed the crimes. That, I think, is in summary, are the events. We can talk much more about as we go on.
I think there is something about the distinctive nature of the murders that figures here. It wasn't, it was, in every sense of the word, a wanton murder, wasn't it? He had robbed, gotten the money, no resistance, and then he just shot him more or less as a formality.
Well, it was a motiveless set of crimes,
Yeah.
the two crimes. He didn't know the people, so far as we can find out, and we really tried very hard to find out if he ever met either of the two men. He'd never met them. And he didn't really do it for the money because there was very little money involved. You know, he got $100 one night and $125 the next, and said himself that he really didn't do it for the money. In fact, he could have had a defense, which he could have probably gotten life imprisonment if he'd wanted it, by saying that he did it for the money and shot these men in the course of committing the crime, because if you kill someone in the course of an armed robbery, you're much more likely to get life than the death sentence. But he didn't even want to do that in his defense. They were peculiar crimes because he was a very intelligent, although somewhat tortured man, and the crimes just made no sense. There's no sense in any way you can understand it, except that, as Gilmore said to many people afterward, he said, if you want to understand murder, don't look for a motive. Look to the idea that a person gets so full of rage that they commit murder, that it's a way of opening a valve. And he spoke of his murder that way, as a matter of venting tension. So that they were, in that sense, they were motiveless crimes. The question that you're left with is, when you get this enormous tension, a tension so great that you have to commit murder, what is the thing that's even worse than the murder? You know, I always work on the assumption that people do the best they can do under the circumstances. You know, that we're always trying to do the very best we can do. Sometimes that behavior may seem absolutely bizarre to other people.
What was Hitler's alternative?
That is the perfect posing of the question. What would have been worse than the life? But of course, you see, I think with Hitler, let me amend my first remark. When we're in a bad situation, we do the best we can do. I don't think Hitler saw himself as being in a bad situation. I think he saw himself as a world leader, obviously, and that he thought that he was going to, that he was bringing some kind of salvation to the world. So my remarks really wouldn't apply directly or head-on to Hitler. They would apply only to the last month, let's say, of Hitler's life, when he obviously was in a deteriorating situation and even had to know it himself. But as far as Gilmore goes, Gilmore was in a situation I think we all understand, which is that he felt as if he was in a box and he couldn't get out of that box. He'd left prison, and he had a feel, and to a large extent, as if he was still in prison, as if the habits of his life and the circumstances of his life were such that he just couldn't get out and become what he wanted to become. He couldn't, if you will, he couldn't express the fantasies he'd had while he was in prison of leading another kind of life. And so under those circumstances, the tension increased and increased in him. He also had a love affair with a girl. He was very much in love with a girl, and she finally left him because his habits were so bad. And when she left him, he went slowly crazy over a week. Not crazy in the sense of being committed to a mental hospital, but crazy in the sense that this tension, this unendurable tension, got greater and greater and greater in him, and finally it erupted into murder.
Well, let me ask you this: if I'm uncomfortable with the terms in part because of ignorance, in part because they seem to be infinitely inscrutable. But suppose we use words like psychopath and neurotic to describe Gilmore. What is it that drew you to try to probe the character of somebody who is almost by definition inscrutable?
Let me say that if I've been writing a more conventional novel, because I do call this a novel for reasons we can discuss later, I would have made every effort to get into his mind, and I would have attempted to explain him. And I would have had my explanation. Before Gilmore, who as I say, was a relatively intelligent man, he's a man who's by turns is surprisingly intelligent and surprisingly disappointing. And I found as I was doing the research on him that some of the time when I'd come across turns of mind in him that were startling and impressive. And then just about the time I begin to feel, well, I'm really dealing with a man who's possessed of, not say a superior intelligence, but certainly a good intelligence, he would say or do something that I thought was so dumb that he'd be disappointing. He was very much like someone you know in life, who's alternately pleasing and disappointing you all the time. But if I'd written it as a novel, I would have made every effort to understand him and to explain him to the reader. I began to feel that it was more interesting not to. I began to feel that I had to change some of my ideas about what literature should consist of. I've always leaned on the side that literature finally is a guide, that it explains complex matters to us. It gives us a deeper understanding of our existence. And I felt that maybe the time had come, at least for me in my own work, to do a book where I don't explain it to the reader, and in part I can't explain all of it to the reader. I can merely make the reader tremendously familiar with material they usually don't encounter.
But that does make you disinterested, does it?
It didn't make me disinterested at all. I'll
No.
probably think about Gilmore for the rest of my life.
Right. Now, would you say, for instance, that by contrast, Truman Capote did try to explain the motives of his killers, that he attempted something more conventional?
Well, I think he did try, and I think Truman succeeded in understanding his killers. And I think he did I think in Cold Blood is Truman and I are just not washing each other's hands. I don't think that's a wonderful book. But I do think that one of the reasons in Cold Blood is a wonderful book is because I think the characters he had there, those two fellows were essentially pretty dull fellows. In prison terms, they were punks. Mm-hmm. Gilmore was a real convict. Again, using the prison term. To prisoners, the word convict is a term of approbation.
Right.
It's the equivalent of a good soldier.
Mm-hmm.
And that, any man who's a good soldier in an army is a complex individual. There's no such thing as a good soldier, I believe, who's a simple man. And I say a complex individual because to be a good soldier, you've got to have abilities that are opposed to one another. That is, you've got to be very disciplined on the one hand and very spontaneous on the other. They're all in the same way that artists come out of opposites, so good soldiers do. And I'd even go so far as to say good convicts do. Because they have to have a sense of justice, and they also have to have a great command of violent techniques and what have you. Gilmore...
Which in a way accounts for Gilmore's acquiescence in the penalty that he suffered, right?
There we get into very tricky ground, because I think most convicts would feel that they would question what Gilmore did. I can't speak for convicts, and I wouldn't attempt to. But from my understanding of how, let's say, these men I call convicts as opposed to inmates or prisoners would feel, I would expect that there'd be a great division of opinion among them, whether Gilmore did the right thing or the wrong thing. Because part of the mentality of the convict is that whatever society does is wrong. They see themselves as an army opposed to society, after all. I mean, their pride is that society's not been able to break them, that they remain men, that they're not broken.
Yeah, so, but isn't my understanding of a convict in the professional sense in which you use it, somebody who understands that society has its own resources and its own rules, and does not question the enforceability of those rules? That is to say, typically a convict will only plead not guilty as a tactic.
Yes, a convict certainly has if not respect, he certainly has a great sophistication about the power of society to enforce its rules. He also has a great sophistication about those ways in which he can beat society. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's their life study, after all.
Yeah.
I mean, a man who's been in jail more than half his life gets to know an awful lot about how to manipulate society.
Yeah, yeah.
And in that sense, they would respect Gilmore because they would have seen it as a vast and mighty manipulation.
Yeah. And
certainly, from Gilmore's point of view, it was a huge, whatever else his motives, one of his motives had to be that he wasn't going to go out quietly, that this was going to be an extraordinary manipulation that he could put upon the normal social procedure, which by that time, of course, had been that when a man was sentenced to death, he put in an appeal, and pretty automatically his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and so the machinery of the law turned. In other words, a death sentence was really just a formal sentence in the sense that they give people death sentences, but they didn't execute them.
Oh, we should mention this was the first execution in 10 years.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, now, you were pursuing the difference between the killers of Truman Capote, in Truman Capote's book, and yours being a convict, theirs being sort of
punks,
extemporaneous no-goods. Now, there was this sort of a hard consistency in Gilmore's attitude, who had been more days in jail than out of jail at age 34, 35?
He was 36.
36, yeah. Now, many people who have read your book seem to be making heavy weather over the setting, the Mormon desert, the experiences of people who had settled in that area. Is there a sense in which you intended to conjoin the history of Utah or Mormonism with this black theater? Is there a sense in which they were made for each other, or is it just coincidental?
Again, it's one of the unanswered and deep questions of the book. A lot of people thought that Gilmore selected Mormons to execute. Parenthetically, one reason the book is called The Executioner's Song, and I realized this only after I'd finished it, and the title had been there for a long time, is that Gilmore is also the executioner. In a sense, this is the story of an executioner who's, in his turn, is executed.
Yeah.
But the question was whether Gilmore was executing Mormons as such. And there's much evidence for it, and at the same time it remains speculation and supposition. It's very easy when you're in Utah to spot a Mormon. It's not hard. I mean, half the people in the state are Mormon, and they have a look. You know, they're immensely religious people, and particularly active Mormons, which is the word they use for devout. I just have a certain look. They have a missionary look. They look a little bit like Jehovah's Witnesses in New York. They stand out. You can see they lead very clean lives. I mean, Mormons.
You think the gasoline attendant was instantly the Mormon to Gary Gilmore when he pulled up there?
Oh, I would think so. Put it this way, I think
tall and square and...
you'd be wrong, but you wouldn't be wrong more often than one time in 10.
Yeah.
I mean, I spent time in Utah for the first time, and after I'd been there a couple of weeks, it was very easy for me to be right on who was a Mormon and who wasn't nearly all the time. And Gilmore, after all, had a mother who was Mormon, and he'd grown up, he'd spent some of his boyhood in Salt Lake City. I don't think it would have been hard for him to spot a Mormon. So he may well have chosen to murder Mormons as such.
And the motivation for that would have been what?
I think finally an intangible motivation. We were talking about this immense rage he felt that had gotten to the point where he couldn't control it. I think he saw the Mormons, after all, are tremendously social-minded people. I mean, if we're going to talk about society, Mormons epitomize society. They epitomize society in terms of a very strong society with a great emphasis on cleanliness, order, discipline. And to Gilmore, who's getting out of jail and finding it very hard to live in the square world, the Mormons would have been his new jailers. So that would have been part of it. There were also old family resentments. His mother, who was been a Mormon all her life, lost her house, and she went to the Mormon church at one point to ask them to save it for her. It's a very complicated business, but finally they didn't. And Gilmore was not necessarily a man who would look into all the niceties and nuances of a complex situation before making up his mind. There's reason to believe he was furious at the Mormons for the church for having let the house go. There were factors.
I won't reveal the conclusions you drew to the extent that you drew them, but is that why he elected to have a Catholic priest at his side when he was dispatched as a sort of a continuing rebuff of Mormonism?
There again, you know, I find when I talk about him, you know, when you invent one of your character, you can always explain everything about him. When you're dealing with someone who lived, and you've spent I mean, I know him better than I know most of the people in my own family by now, but I find I talk about him the way I would talk about someone who's in my family, which is I don't understand people in my family inside out. I can merely speculate about them. I think Gilmore loved playing games with the people around him, and so it was very much in his character to have a great friendship with a Catholic chaplain and with a Mormon chaplain, and to play each of them against the other, and to use them to the hilt. At the same time, since he was a man who had surprising veins of compassion or real feeling, along with great, you know, large areas that were absolutely unfeeling, there'd be moments when he'd have genuine relations with the Catholic chaplain and the Mormon chaplain. And I think it may come down to no more than I think at the end the Catholic chaplain was terribly concerned with being close to Gilmore at the end. And the Mormon chaplain, who, if anything, I think in this situation loved him more than the Catholic chaplain, was the sort of man who hated a show of feeling. So there might have been something where the Mormon chaplain might have been saying to himself, my God, just look at that Catholic chaplain getting near to Gilmore. And the two chaplains might disagree about what really happened in terms of who was closest at the end. Gilmore spoke snidely about both of them from time to time.
Yeah, yeah. What was the point that you sought to stress when you devoted as much time as you did to the kind of macabre curiosity that the public developed about those last days, the efforts to film him going from the truck into the cannery where he was executed, the helicopter that flew over there, the number of press who wanted to examine the chair to which he was attached for the actual execution. Did you intend that censoriously, or were you simply saying that's the way human curiosity is?
I got fascinated at a certain point in drawing an objective picture of American society that I could, using the thread of this story. I found that while one didn't go from the very depths of American society to the absolute heights, one did cover quite a spectrum of American society, from people who were relatively poor and powerless to people who, while they weren't, let's say they weren't running the state of Utah, nonetheless they were fairly high up in the functioning of the state of Utah, but in the governmental apparatus of Utah. And so as a social drama, it was fascinating to me to see the relation of the media to it. The media was like another wheel. In other words, the true gears were operating. Gilmore's fundamental battle was with the powers that would and would not execute him.
Yeah.
Those huge social powers that wanted to execute him, and those huge social powers that wanted to change his sentence to life imprisonment. The media came in, almost like a helicopter, if you will, and hovered all over the place. It never truly exercised real power, but it kept affecting and distorting and changing everything that was going on. And I thought, this, I had so much material to draw on in writing this book that I thought, this is part of this invaluable material. The material seemed invaluable to me. I thought, I'm finally getting some picture of how American society works. It works so much better and so much worse than I'd always thought it did. It was interesting to me to see the way American society was, in certain ways, was a more efficient and effective social machine than I'd expected. There was a little more fairness at certain levels than somehow I'd thought. All that was interesting to me.
And also, decisions were more thoughtful than you had expected.
One of the things I discovered while writing the book is I began to feel there is such a thing as the American character. At one point, I almost called this book American Virtue, believe it or not. And I was terribly tempted to, because I thought that was the true title, but I then decided it'd be impossible, because everybody would see it as a sardonic title. And what I was saying is American Virtue, it does not exist, and I could just see how the French would see that title and so on. I thought, no, the hell with that. I'll keep calling it the Executioner's Song. But I learned something about Americans in this book that I'd never quite put into words for myself before, which I think in America we're all enormously concerned with being virtuous. It doesn't matter what we do. We can be anything from a drug pusher to a clergyman. We measure ourselves by our virtue. The English might measure themselves by the quality of their manners. The French might measure themselves by the amount of security they establish in their laws and how well nourished are the roots that they put down. I mean, it's a game you can play. You can talk about different nationalities in those terms. But it seems to me there's one thing that characterizes all Americans is that we want to be virtuous. We're obsessed with it. And so what you find is that, what I found is that in the working of the social machine, you'd find people who really played a very small part in the execution of Gary Gilmore, yet they thought about it a great deal, and they worried about it. And it was terribly important to them that they did the right thing and not the wrong thing.
The cousin who turned him in and that kind of thing.
Yeah, but all down to people who, let's say some clerk in a judge's office who might have made a small error on a file, some form that was filed, and would stay up at night to change the form, all that. I'm making up an example, but everybody wanted to do the right thing, and I thought that it may be that rather than that society is evil, maybe what it is a sad comedy. One of the things I found is that people on both sides, I met people who were absolutely decent on both sides, who were really working might and main to accomplish their ends. I became fascinated with lawyers who are devoted to their clients and see the other side as evil.
And you draw no distinction between those whose devotion led them to want to desire the execution of Gilmore and those whose devotion led them to want him to have a commuted sentence.
Well, I thought the balance was close to perfect here. Yeah. You see, I confess that if you had a convict who wanted to appeal his death sentence, who didn't want to be executed, my sympathies would probably fall on the side of saying, don't execute a man who doesn't want to be executed. It's a large question, we can get into it if you wish. But in this case, where he did want to be executed, then the question got truly interesting. Because does society, in a way, have the right to insist that a man stay alive who does want to be executed?
Which is a matter of plain dumb fact, is over the long term impractical. He tried to commit suicide after all, and presumably one of those times he'd have succeeded.
Yes, but it's different.
The question, of course, is whether the state should be an accomplice in suicide.
Well, but that argument, which was raised by the people who wanted to, wanted his death sentence commuted, the argument that the liberals brought was that Gilmore really wants to commit suicide.
Let him do it.
Let him do it, and don't let the state be dirtied with this terribly unpleasant, disagreeable, and perhaps sinister process of executing a man socially, impersonally. Execution is the key to it there. But I thought about that a long time, and my own opinion, for what it's worth, as I say, I kept my opinions to the side in this while writing the book, is that there's a great difference between committing suicide and being executed. I think there's a difference in one's moral center, if you will, at the moment it happens. Now, for people who believe that death is death and there's nothing to be said about it, that after you die, you're gone forever.
Well, it's a basic theological distinction. It has been forever. So I think it would be hard to disagree with you on that. The fact that people who were violently opposed to his execution were indifferent to the question whether he committed suicide oughtn't to surprise us. Whether they would facilitate the suicide, i.e., by not inspecting his cell every day to make sure that he hadn't had an accumulation of seconal, is a question somewhere in between.
Well, there I think
you may remember that when Goering committed suicide, giving rise to that marvelous lead sentence in the UP Dispatch, Hermann Goering cheated death tonight by committing suicide.
Well, he cheated execution for sure. I mean, it was a bad headline.
Sure.
It was a bad headline, but
the point is that the distinction was sharply drawn. They wanted judicial vengeance, judicial vindication, yes. and in that sense, well, when Pierre Laval was dragged out to an execution in 1945, he had taken these pills, and they pumped his stomach and tons of all for the purpose of keeping him alive for an extra 15 minutes so that he could be properly shot. So there is a tremendous symbolism that is vested in that distinction, isn't
well, I think execution is double-edged. That is, if a man doesn't want to be executed and tries to escape it.
Yeah, it's different. That's different.
Then society does get this enormous urge to carry out the act. Yeah. In this case, I think it's different because if a man says, I did wrong and I want to be executed, that's different from committing suicide.
Which Gilmore wouldn't do.
No, he did do that. He said
he wanted to be executed, but he was never contrite.
No. Oh, I see. You mean to say I did wrong? I think he was not contrite. I think what he was is he felt that he had used up his chances.
Yeah, he's fatalistic.
And that more than fatalistic, even I think he had a certain contempt for people. Ultimately, he had a certain contempt for people who finally had not done what they were supposed to do with their life. And therefore, from his point of view, the only dignified thing to do at this point was to be executed. But I think also it was terribly important to him, given the way he'd lived his life, that he be able to face his executioners. You see, that it was preferable. He had a set of choices. His first choice was freedom, after he tried to escape the night before the execution. His second choice was execution. His third was suicide. Right. And it was fascinating to me the way these were definite steps to him.
And his fourth was life in jail. That was the worst.
That was the worst.
Yeah. The fact that we can talk or at least that you can, as interestingly about his motives now, and that so many people on reading your book will be invited to speculate on his motives and on the motives of people who were major characters in it, suggests, at least at one level, the utility of this new form of yours. Let me ask you this. Do you think of it as a paradigm? And if so, what would happen to, say, Crime and Punishment if one were to undertake to rewrite it with accepting all of the inhibitions that you accepted in this book?
It would disappear. It would not be a good book. I hold no brief for this method. I don't feel I've now discovered first of all, I didn't discover it, but apart from that, I don't feel that I have or a few of us have a unique way now of writing a book which will do away with the old novel. What I felt is that this story had certain qualities that just begged to be done this way. One of them was that there was an enormous amount of material. I mean, I had a great deal of good luck. I happened to have an interviewer before I even started the book. There were 60 interviews to look at, and they were done by one of the people who's a character in this book, Larry Schiller, who had bought the rights to Gilmore's Life. Now, he happens to be an excellent interviewer. And one of the things that was particularly good about it from my point of view is his point of view and his style of interviewing is altogether different from mine. So before I even started the book, I'd had an excellent interviewer working, let's say, from another place, doing interviews.
But you went back and interviewed those same people.
Well, I had to
cases,
because
yeah.
I was interested in other aspects of them than he was. But nonetheless, I started with a great deal. I was able to see the story before I began it. And that gave me the feeling that this method would be ideal for this book because there was so much material. And the story was so good. I could spend my literary life working to get a story as good as this. If I had ever invented a story as good as this, I would have written the novel. Since I've never written a novel like this before, it's because I never got that good a story. But one doesn't need, when you don't have quite that good a story, what you have are other qualities you can bring to a book. There's every reason to keep writing novels. It's just that this particular one, I'm happy it was done this way, because what I wanted to do with it, and what I discovered at a certain point, I think this is really the core of it, is I thought I can write a book that will really make people think in a way they haven't quite thought before. This material made me begin to look at 10 or 20 serious questions in an altogether new fashion. And it made me humble in that I just didn't know the answers. I mean, I've had the habit for years of feeling I could dominate any question pretty quickly. It's been my vanity. And it was an exceptional experience to spend all these months and find that I was that gently, but inevitably, I was finding myself in more profound, not confusion, but more profound doubt about my ability to give definitive answers to these questions. But what I had instead is I was collecting materials that I could think about for the rest of my life. In other words, I was getting new experience. And so I thought it might be very nice just once to write a book which doesn't have answers but poses delicate questions with a great deal of evidence and a great deal of material and let people argue over it. I feel there are any number of areas in this book where there are people who have better answers to give than I have.
You said a moment ago that if I wanted you, we would touch on the question why you novelized. No, you didn't novelize. Why you called it a novel? The answer is yes. I would like to go into that.
All right.
Did this make those questions stand out more sharply than otherwise they would have, or what?
I think of nonfiction as living on two stomachs, like the cow. In other words, the material is eaten, it's partially digested, it's regurgitated, and then it's digested again. In other words, in a book of nonfiction, there is a tendency in nonfiction to present the author's conclusions to the reader. And while this is not true for all works of nonfiction, I think it's true for most of them, most serious works of nonfiction. You read it because you want to know what the author thinks definitively about a subject. And the author will present his thinking process to you sometimes he doesn't. But he literally digests the material. And when he does present a scene, it's as illustrative material to make a difficult passage more simple. In a novel, and the one thing that nonfiction calls for is understanding, clear understanding of what's being said. It's hard to think of a good book of nonfiction whose waters are not clear. Whereas I think in fiction, what we want to do is we want to create life. We want to give the reader the feeling that they're participating in the life of the characters they're reading about. And to the degree they're participating in it, they shouldn't necessarily understand everything that's going on any more than we do in life. Maybe they should understand somewhat more than we do in life, but not everything. The moment we understand everything in a book, it can't possibly be fiction, I'd say, by the way I'm defining it. Now, the fact that these are real people, and I attempt to be as scrupulous as I could to what happened, subject to the limitations of journalism, means only that this is a novel which is not an imaginative novel. It did not come out of my imagination. But I wrote it as if it had.
Well, now one is not entirely clear what you're saying here. You say you wrote it as though it had. Are you simply referring to things like sequences and liberties with the chronology and that sort of thing?
No.
Or are you saying that there are actually exchanges that were invented by you and put inside quotation marks?
No, there's very little invention in the book. I mean, I would not say that every single line of dialogue in the book literally came out of an interview. But I think the amount of invention of dialogue is very small, and almost always it was functional. Sometimes you just have to end a scene, and
sure.
it was done.
Somebody has to say good night. Yeah.
Yeah, out of respect for the reader, if you will. Sometimes you have to turn a scene and just leave it with a little flourish or something, just for the reading of the book. But what I meant is that when we pick up a novel and we read it, we have an experience. We say, I'm reading a novel. And I wanted the reader to have that experience. That is, I wanted a reader who didn't know anything at all about the source of this book, who the author was, and how it came to be written, or anything like that, to pick it up and think they were reading a novel. It's just a matter of style, if you get down to it. You could just give the book to 50 people who know nothing about it, and you could say to them, what is this? They said, it's a novel. I wanted to read like a novel. And so I used my skills, such as they are over these 30 years, to write it as a novel. Yeah. But it is accurate. That was the requirement, because, I had to overcome 10,000 habits, intimate habits in the course of writing. I'd create certain people. See, I say create, they're real people, but as you're writing a book, you feel you create your characters. Yeah. And then they'd meet, and there'd be two people I was interested in. And I knew the reader hopefully was interested in them. And so I thought, well, when they meet, what I want is to have a very good scene between them, as I would if I'd been writing the novel. But in fact, they'd met and not that much had happened. It was sort of a disappointing scene. So I felt bound to stay with the disappointment of the scene. And half the scenes in that book are a little less than they ought to be. But then
because they were transcriptions?
Because they came from the interviews. And what happened when the two people met was that it wasn't quite as interesting as everyone had thought it would be. But what I also thought is that after a while began to add its own flavor. Ideally, if it worked, it would add its own flavor. It would make the book even more lifelike, because life is like that. Half the meetings we have prove to be less than we expected. And then occasionally, when we are least ready for it, something very interesting can happen. And I thought the book, in a way, because it didn't have just my mind working out a form, but because it came out of all the people who, one way or another, contributed to the book, I had the feeling it was a little closer to life than anything else I'd worked on before.
Mr. Jeff Greenfield, who is familiar to viewers of this program, is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, a former aide to Mayor Lindsay and Senator Robert Kennedy. He is an author, is engaged in regular television work and screenwriting. Mr. Greenfield.
Thank you. I cannot resist the temptation to pose one of those great questions that you have said that you are used to dominating, with full recognition that you came out of this book uncertain as to your attitude toward capital punishment. But to pose it in its baldest form, do you believe there are people whose deeds render them unfit to live?
If you ask me as a matter of personal belief, yes, probably. Probably I do.
Let me take it the next step. I apologize. I know this is literal, but that's a law school education for you.
No, besides which people would be sore if those questions didn't get asked.
Well, that's right. I was being unnecessarily humble. Do we, as other people, have the right to make that judgment? Now, you say as a matter of personal belief, you believe that you can say some people commit deeds that render them unfit to live. Do we have the process, the criminal justice system, I suppose, to turn that judgment into reality, that is, by condemning people to death?
Well, there's where the question gets immense and probably unanswerable, because I would be highly suspicious of any group of people, no matter how well-intentioned, who take on that right because we, the more we know how imperfect we all are. And also the key question is this: for every murderer who, let's say, commits an absolutely abominable crime, for every 100 murderers who commit an absolutely abominable crime, how many of them are finally unredeemable in any way at all? The number may be very small. There's where the ability to be certain of oneself begins to falter. Also, but then on the other side, you have this other terrible practical problem, which is when you have men, who, let's say, the worst kind of murderers, the kind who seem absolutely unredeemable, when they're in prisons for many, many years, they become virtually depraved animals, some of them, particularly if they're living on death row. And they can poison the very inside of a prison. They certainly take the general level of life in a prison and they lower it.
I guess to violate the intentional fallacy one more time, when you'd gotten finished with the Executioner's Song, I wonder whether there was a moment that never made it into the book when you said to yourself either, "I'm glad he's dead," or "What a horror that this man died." I mean, it seems to me that there would have had to have been some kind of moment when you stopped up short and had to confront how you felt about Gilmore.
Oh, I lived with it after all. I found something a little close to the sort of experiences you might have in life. Let's say if you had a relative who had an incurable illness, and you really spent a lot of time virtually hoping for their death because they were in such pain and it was just so awful. And at the moment they died, a party was very happy, and yet another party who felt this tremendous sense of loss. That might be analogous to some of the things I felt about Gilmore, because on the one hand, having gotten to know him that well, you did have to sympathize, at least I did have to sympathize to a great extent with his desire to be executed the way he saw it. I felt in a funny way that this man, who had done all these terrible things and had all these incredible frustrations in his life, was now finally having an ultimate frustration, which is he couldn't even die in that way he had chosen, which was his last attempt by his own lights to find some odd kind of dignity. And so in that sense, I sympathized with that desire up to a point, so that when he was executed, there was a certain feeling of, yes, at last. But on the other hand, I suddenly thought, my God, this man, with all he had in him, this tremendously complex and somewhat talented man, this tortured man, this man who was not without compassion, this man who was certainly, by any measure, you couldn't say he was wholly unredeemable. He was too complex to say that quickly about him. This man was dead, and he was truly dead. I mean, that was why I took the execution right through the autopsy, because there was something about, I wanted the reader to feel, that's what it means when we kill a man, that even when this man who wanted to die and succeeded in getting society to execute him, even when he is killed, we still feel this horrible shock and loss. And I wanted the reader to live with this incredible complexity that's involved in not just the process of execution, but with that most mysterious fact that we live and then we die. One babbles as one speaks about it, but there's something profound in the recognition of it. I don't mean by my effort. I mean just when we come face to face with it, it's awesome.
Bill, can I ask you? It's a question that I've always wondered about the relationship between the conservative philosophy and the support for the principle of capital punishment. And let me just phrase it as briefly as I can. I can understand, theoretically, that there are people who commit deeds that render them unfit to live. I think the way that Norman Mailer just described it. One feels that about people, that these people have forfeited whatever membership in the community of people they have by what they did. What is difficult for me to understand is how, given an attitude of mind which recognizes how frail the instruments of public decisions are, government, the criminal justice system, the bureaucracy, we can't mail letters, we can't get Social Security checks to old people, we can't tear down the right buildings, how one is willing to place sufficient faith in any instrument to say, look, we know we are imperfect, so we'll run that risk when it comes to putting someone in jail. But given the finality of death, on a practical, not theoretical basis, how do we say that we have that much faith in the institution of criminal justice that we trust it to put people to death?
Well, my own feeling is that you've swallowed a beam and strained on a gnat, because I would disagree with both of you that there's anybody who is, quote, unfit to live, because I think that the word unfit is much more difficult to define than the word, than this much simpler question, is it possible to codify the social will on the matter of inappropriate punishment? I think for certain crimes, the death sentence is appropriate.
How do you make that judgment if you don't say the person has forfeited the right to live?
The fact that the federal post office cannot be trusted to deliver my mail in time is, I think, a dodgy comparison for the kind of attention we give to matters of guilt and innocence. Now, I wouldn't say that Gilmore was, quote, unfit to live, but I would say that that the sentence of execution, given what he did, justified draconian punishment. I believe, as Walter Burns explicated so well in his last book, in his book on capital punishment, that a society not only has the right but the obligation to punish, and that it's a cop-out simply to assume that punishment belongs in another world.
No, excuse me, but that is the cop-out, because that whole argument inevitably blurs the distinction between the case for punishment, which I think is quite sound, and the case for what kind of punishment. I mean, what I think Norman Mailer was saying was that when you look upon death as opposed to any other kind of sanction, you are dealing with something very different. I mean, the Spenkeling case, which is the first man executed against his will, he was executed under a Florida law which specifically said execution is to be done only for especially heinous murders. His murder was the firing of a bullet into his sleeping companion who may or may not have terrorized him, while murderers in Florida who had tortured people, who had done things infinitely worse, didn't receive it. What this goes to is not the validity of punishment, but whether we believe our system can properly weigh this question when the punishment is this final.
Well,
I mean, isn't that what we're talking about?
An argument against the arbitrary administration of justice is not an argument against punishing that person against whom you move arbitrarily.
It is when the punishment is death.
It's an argument over irregularity.
No.
If you catch only one person who's speeding at 100 miles an hour and let 99 people go, it's not an argument against stopping the one you caught.
And you keep evading the point. Of course we have to have an imperfect system because we're not perfect of any kind of punishment. It seems to me that that is what defines, that is what settles the question of capital punishment. You keep talking about speeding tickets, whether we should punish. Nobody disagrees with that except 3 people who are on government grants.
No, but if capital
the question is death.
If capital punishment is the only apposite punishment for certain kinds of crimes, then that you should execute Spenkeling, who, by the way, shot somebody in the back of the head and also participated in digging an axe in his skull, then sat on his carcass and drank a bottle of vodka with his companion and toasted to their accomplishment. That there are other people who have, as you put it, committed equally heinous crimes leaves you over at that end of the horror spectrum in which your resentment is over the sluggishness of the processes of justice, not over the execution of Spenkeling.
Let me just go back to Norman Mailer, if I could, for 1 second. Did you find when you were immersed in this book, that the mechanics of the criminal justice system, that is to say the mechanics of appeal or post-conviction judgments, in a way were almost rendered, I'm trying to think of the right word, rendered sort of trivial in comparison to the question that was at hand here? Did the specter of death in a way make these processes to you seem almost bizarre and banal by comparison?
I think the process has to seem bizarre because the law is designed in most cases to deal with, I mean, anyone who's ever had an experience in the law courts knows how irritating the law can be because the law is not interested in the nuances of anything. You know, facts have to be established. On the basis of these facts being established, a ladder of logic is built, and on that ladder of logic, the 2 ladders cross one another at some point, and whoever builds the better ladder presumably wins the case. Now, obviously, it's more complicated than that, but one of the maddening things about the law is how factual and exact you have to be and how you have to establish this apparatus of this factology, if you will, this ladder. And of course, when you come to death, the law, by its nature, tends to break down. It can codify punishments, but the law is not equipped, emotionally speaking, if you will. The people who exercise the law are not equipped by their training to deal with this very delicate question, which comes up one time in 100,000 or a million cases. So it's going to look bizarre. It's going to look absurd. You can almost take it for granted. You know, if you write a war novel, obviously, war is going to seem, in some of its aspects, hideous. You don't write a war novel to show that war is hideous. So I don't write this book about capital punishment to say the law is absurd. I take it for granted it's going to look terribly absurd in it. What surprised me in a funny way is that given all the absurdity of the way they were acting, given the fact that Gilmore finally made his point, which is the law had to be bent and tortured in order to get him executed on schedule, which in a way was one of Gilmore's revenges on the law. Nonetheless, I was surprised at the amount of real feeling on the side of the executioners, as they took their role very, very seriously.
I have to ask you one question about style, because it has become such a remarked upon fact that this is such a spare narrative, spare in the sense that one is used to a Norman Mailer striding through the pages, if not at the center, then certainly very close up there. Was there a temptation for Aquarius or Norman Mailer or whoever the persona was at any point in the writing of this book to break the rule? I mean, was there a point, was there a scene, was there a thing that happened where you said, I want to be there?
Well, Aquarius had an Alfred Hitchcock cameo role, didn't he?
At one point, I never was going to use Aquarius, but when I started the book, I thought I need some ironic framework to deal with the book. Right. And I was going to create a character, a movie writer, a middle-aged movie writer whose marriage had broken up and he was living in Paris and he was miserable, just a big ungainly man with two huge suitcases who became a figure in the Latin Quarter. And everybody wondered, what is this man with these two huge suitcases doing? Well, they happened to be all the interviews of the Gary Gilmore case. And he was writing it, he was going to be writing a huge treatment for someone like, let's say, Francis Ford Coppola, who said to him, put everything in, don't leave anything out. I want to know all about this man Gilmore before I make the movie. And so that was going to be the means by which I would be able to comment on the action.
And surface occasionally. Yeah.
And surface not through myself, but through this fictional character.
Was there a draft that actually had that?
I started the book that way, and then at a certain point I said, this is ridiculous. You just have to bite the bullet. You have to be brave enough to write this book without putting yourself in it at all.
Thank you, Mr. Mailer. Thank you, Mr. Greenfield. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
For a printed bound transcript of this program, send $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. Indicate the subject of the program and please allow 3 weeks for delivery. For a free copy of the Firing Line newsletter, send a request to the transcript address. This program was produced by SICA, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding was provided by this station and by other public television stations.